The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week my guest is Sam Borden, Global Sports Correspondent for ESPN. Sam Borden, before we get to all the writing stuff, and this is going to be an interesting conversation because I can see it, but the listeners can't. I'm looking at the wall behind your desk and your setup here. And can you describe for the listeners what you have back there?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. So behind me is a really large, bulletin board equivalent. I think it's made out of foam. My wife made it actually, and it is a collection of various media credentials to events that I've covered during my career. And honestly, Brian, it's been there forever. I had a similar one when we lived in France. And then when we moved here to Connecticut, my wife sort of put together another one because she's a real crafter. But the pandemic made it so that it was all of a sudden like a really big talking point because I'd never been on a Zoom before. But now, it's like a big part of our lives. And everybody wants to know, oh, what's that one in the corner? What's the yellow one over there? Like it's a big topic of conversation. And it's something that I had never really thought about until COVID.
So is that constantly updated or is that like a static thing? Like it's done?
No, that's the thing. That one, the one behind me pretty much stops with our time in France. And so I've been back 6 years now. So yeah, all of those are from earlier in my career, up till, my time in France. I tried to encourage her to get a mix of like different stages of my career too. She's very crafty. So like there's one that's from the Division III Final Four, which I covered in Salem, Virginia as a sophomore in college when I was just trying to get clips anywhere I could and freelanced it with a buddy of mine who now is also a professional journalist. So that was 1998, I think. And, up to World Cups and Olympics and, Super Bowls and things like that.
Do you have a favorite single press pass? Maybe whether it's on that one or on the other board or just that you have. Do you have a single, like one that's the coolest?
I'm looking over my shoulder. I will say that I love that she chose, I don't know if you can see it, but there's one that's sort of right over my left shoulder that is from the Triple Crown.
Yes.
It's a Triple Crown credential. I covered the Preakness. I don't know why, but I just think it's very artistic. It has horses. Like it just is like a good looking credential. I think like a lot of the big sports organizations sort of just use the same template over and over. Again, I don't know if you can see at the bottom, but like those are all of my Major League Baseball writers' credentials. And it just is the same one, but a new year after year after year. So I appreciate the creativity that the Triple Crown organizers put into making the credentials for the Kentucky Derby, Preakness, and Belmont a little bit more artistic.
Well, it is the best background I think I've seen in a very long time. So that's cool.
You.
And I've got to say, we're colleagues at St. Bonaventure. We both teach in the online master's programs that we have here. And along with that, you have probably one of the coolest job titles that anybody I've had on the show in a very long time. Your official title is, I believe, Global Sports Correspondent for ESPN.
Yeah, that's I honestly think that was it's not as relevant now as to when I was hired. Before I worked at ESPN, I worked for the New York Times, and that was, when I was living in France, and I was the first international sports correspondent that the Times had living abroad. And when I came back after our sort of 3 years abroad were finished, I was approached by an agent from CAA who had done a lot of work with ESPN and said, hey, ESPN is interested in increasing its storytelling in the international space. Would you be interested in talking to them? And this agent sort of put together these meetings and, the ultimate move that I made from the Times to ESPN. But at the time, ESPN was really interested in enhancing its international work. And I came in as a part of the international group originally. Now I'm in my 7th year at ESPN, and, things, as anybody who has followed, media in general could probably tell you, things at ESPN and everywhere in the media landscape have changed. And so I do a lot more NFL work and NBA work and domestic storytelling than I did when I first arrived. So yes, my title is Global Sports Correspondent. I still cover the Olympics, and I was at the Men's World Cup in Qatar last winter, and I do a lot of international work, but I also do a lot of, profiles for NFL Countdown and, College Game Day and things like that. So, it's a fun title, but I think it largely came from what my title was at the New York Times. And the truth is, depending on who I'm talking to, I'm a writer, I'm a television reporter, I'm a sideline reporter sometimes, like I'm a podcaster. It really is, a multi-platform landscape these days. And as I'm sure you talk to your students and on this show about quite often, if you're not able to work in lots of different spaces, you're probably not maximizing, your value for whatever organization you're working for.
So speaking of job titles, international sports correspondent for the New York Times is probably about as good as it gets, and based in Paris. I mean, that just sounds like the most romantic job title possible in journalism, and very, I don't want to say antiquated, but very of another media generation. So what was the reality like? Because you hear international correspondent, you hear correspondent in Paris, your mind goes to like Hemingway and long lunches on the Seine and all this. What's the reality? What was the reality of that job? And how did you get from beat writer, columnist, the kind of traditional sports jobs, to a role like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And you're right that, the fantasy of it and the reality of it are pretty disparate. The short version of how I got there is when I interviewed at the Times, and I think when almost anybody interviews at the Times, particularly back when they had a sports section, and sadly that sports section now no longer exists, but when they had a sports section and I was interviewing, you interview there with people way beyond just the desk you're going to work on, because the idea is that they only want to hire journalists who are not just specialists in any one particular thing. You should be able to jump in and report a crime story if you need to, or jump in and report, like a soft feature or breaking news. And so I interviewed with, I think, 10 or 11 different editors outside of the sports department. And many of them asked me, what else are you interested in? And the truth for me, Brian, is that I'm not a big sports fan. I'm not somebody that loves any particular team or player or sport even. I mean, I love golf, but not necessarily to cover, but to play. And so my interests in journalism are really more about satisfying my own personal curiosity, meeting interesting people, and telling stories that I find compelling. And so when I was having those interviews and these editors were asking me, like, what else are you interested in? I answered, honestly, and said, like, I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in culture. I'm interested in, trends and technology. And a number of the editors asked me, would you ever be interested in being a foreign correspondent? And I think that's kind of a question they ask almost anybody who comes to the Times, because it's a particular type of person and a particular skill set that you need to do that job. But I said yes, I was interested in it. And mostly I was interested in getting hired. So I said yes to almost all of the questions they asked me. But after a couple of years of covering the New York Giants, I was approached by the sports editor, Joe Sexton, who's a wonderful man and a wonderful editor, and he said to me, look, I know that you're curious about things beyond the Super Bowl, and international expansion is a big priority for this company. Why don't you take this football offseason and go to Europe a couple of times and bring me back some interesting stories? And so that began probably like a 6-month stretch where I did that. I went overseas to different places, reported a few different stories, came back, wrote them, they liked them, went back over, got a few others, came back, built some relationships. And after about 5 or 6 months of doing that, they said, look, we'd like to make this, we think there's enough there. We think you have the eye for it. We'd like you to go over there and do it. And so I went over there, and then, to answer your question about the reality versus the fantasy, the truth is we moved there when my eldest daughter was 3 and my youngest daughter was 5 months. And so when you have young children, whether you live in France or Connecticut or anywhere else, the reality of life is pretty similar. And so, yes, I traveled around all over the continent, all over the world, but I was trying to get home as fast as I can from almost anywhere I was, because my wife was battling, 2 young kids in a country where French was not our first language, and dealing with potty training in school and new friends and markets and different currency and all of those kinds of things. So there were some amazing moments. We went vacationing in Marrakesh and Morocco, and went skiing in the Alps and, in Switzerland, and went to the beach in the south of France. All of that was amazing, but there were a lot of really tough moments where, my kid wouldn't sleep through the night, and we had to try to figure out how to explain to a French speaking doctor, oh, she has an ear infection, maybe,
Right.
And so I think, depending on sort of what moments you found my wife in, if you asked her about the experience, her answer would probably be a little bit different than my answer.
So I want to back up a little bit. You said you're not a really big sports fan. So how did you wind up as a career sports writer?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when I talk to universities or high schools classes, about how I got into journalism, I tell them this, short anecdote. So I went to college to become a teacher. That was my plan. I wanted to be a English teacher, maybe a professor, which is why I love working for St. Bonaventure and the opportunity to teach even just a little bit. And I hoped that I was going to make the golf team there, but I ended up not making the golf team there. And I had a lot of free time to fill all of a sudden. And so I joined a fraternity and the campus newspaper. And through the fraternity, I met my wife. And through the campus newspaper, I, found a career. And when I showed up to the very first meeting of the Emory Wheel, which was the newspaper, the editor at the time told several of the freshmen, including me, who were sitting there, I have 2 beats that are open for freshmen. One of them is covering student government and, student council meetings and things like that. And the other is covering girls volleyball. Raise your hand, for the one that you're interested in. And I, at the time, being an 18-year-old who had no particular interest in sitting through student government meetings, but saw potentially the fun in going to girls volleyball games, immediately raised my hand for girls volleyball, covered girls volleyball that semester. And, a career was birthed.
So now that you're in your time at ESPN, I know you're less global than maybe you were, but, you don't have a particular beat. And I know you came up kind of as a beat writer and covering, the traditional beats. So I'm curious, what are the story, how do you figure out what you're going to write about, what you're going to cover? I know a lot of it is with editors, probably conversations, but how do you kind of decide what you're going to be working on at any given time?
Yeah. I mean, the hardest thing in any creative pursuit is a blank piece of paper or a blank screen. And, I wrestle with that all the time. And I think, look, it's an incredible blessing to have the freedom that I have to tell the stories that I get to tell, and to be able to bounce from the NFL to the Olympics to something completely offbeat. But it's also a little bit of a curse in that, I only do maybe a dozen or, 15 stories a year, sometimes even fewer than that. And so when you're only doing that many, there's sort of a pressure that they all should be really, really good. When I was covering the Yankees, I think I wrote one year for the New York Daily News, something like 700 stories in 365 days. Because, there were a lot of desire. There was a lot of desire for Yankees coverage, and every day there was a game or, a news story or a spring training or whatever. And so I never focused much on any one piece because I knew that there was another one coming soon. And if, I put together a bunch of doubles and triples in terms of quality, well, that's pretty good in the end. Now I feel like home runs are kind of the minimum, and it better be, I better throw in a few grand slams along the way to make my year worthwhile to continue the metaphor. So I don't, the short answer is I look for things that interest me. I look for things that make me curious. At this point in my career, I'm also very fortunate to have, I guess, both family members, friends, and sometimes even just, I guess, fans or readers who know, hey, Sam might be interested in that. And, one of the stories I did a few years ago that I actually talk a little bit about in the class that I'm teaching now about interviewing is a piece about the former NBA player Darko Milicic. And he was a very, very high draft pick who was a total bust with the Detroit Pistons and basically flamed out of the NBA. And he was a Serbian guy. And after his career ended, he went back to Serbia. And now he's a very successful apple farmer in Serbia. And so a few years ago, I did a big piece that was both a television documentary and a written story about Darko being an apple farmer. And the genesis of that piece was a link to a Reddit thread that a friend of mine sent to me he had seen this Reddit thread that talked very briefly about a Serbian story, a story in a Serbian, website, I guess, or newspaper, that mentioned, oh yeah, Darko Milicic, drafted, so high in the NBA, now as an apple farmer. He sent it to me. It was like, this feels like something that you might be interested in. And like fast forward 8 months later, and there's a 30-minute documentary and a 5,000-word story about Darko Milicic by me on ESPN.com. But a lot of times that's really what it is. Somebody sees something or hears something, or I see something or hear something that makes me curious to know more. And I kick the tires a little bit. And a lot of times there's nothing there, but sometimes there is.
So let's use that Darko story as an example, because it's a great story. I'll throw a link to it in the show notes. So you get this Reddit thread from a friend, you kind of read it through, you get a sense of it. Like, what's your next step? Like once you kind of get that curiosity activated, like you said, you start kicking the tires. What's that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, and that's sort of what I was talking about with the skill set for a foreign correspondent, because particularly with Darko, I mean, that's a story that's in Serbia. It's not in America. It's not like I can pick up the phone and call the Belgrade YMCA and be like, hey, tell me about Darko, the way you might be able to if you were doing a story about somebody in New York City or whatever. There are just like necessary complications that come with working internationally. And so in that particular circumstance, the first thing I did was try to do as much reading as I could, both on English language websites and then using translating, Google Translate or other translating software to try to find out, okay, what's out there, what exists, what is there? I remember with that story, I found like a YouTube interview that Darko had done at some kind of a charity event in Serbia a year or two earlier, but it was all in Serbian. So then I try to find somebody, and this is, again, a different kind of a skill set, finding a fixer, which is what international correspondents use all the time when they go to a foreign country. Usually it's a freelance journalist or a local journalist in the particular place who is multilingual and can help facilitate, interviews or conversations or logistics. Finding us a multilingual journalist in Serbia who I could like and trust to help me, that was a process in and of itself. And a lot of times I'll treat that almost like a job interview. I remember once doing a story in Italy about this sort of like this event that takes place in Florence every year called Calcio Storico, which is basically like this ancient rugby, I guess, where they 4 teams compete on this giant sand pit in Florence. And we did this big story about it in the Times, but finding a fixer in Florence took me a little bit of time. And like, I literally did phone interviews with 3 or 4 multilingual journalists who were in Italy and picked the one that I thought would help, me do that story in the best way. Same thing with Darko. I reached out to a couple of different people who write about basketball in Serbia, or who I have found on the internet who write about, culture in Serbia, but do it in English. Try to figure out, okay, which is the guy or the girl that's going to be able to help me the most here. Found that person. That took a week. Hey, do you know Darko? No, I don't know Darko, but maybe my friend knows Darko. Okay, wait for that connection to be made. Let me write a letter that this person will then translate into Serbian and deliver to Darko. Like, so it's just a process. It was just a process. And the truth is, in the end, look, Darko speaks fine English, not amazing, but fine English. So if I'd been able to get a hold of Darko from the get-go, I could have just been like, hey, it's Sam from ESPN. Can I come to Serbia? But the truth is, going through this process and writing this long letter to Darko explaining what I wanted to do and why I thought it was a story worth telling in his native language, in the end, I think ultimately it made for a stronger relationship and a better story and connection with him, that we went through that process and that we made that connection.
Sure. How many languages do you speak, by the way?
Well, I speak English, moderately well. I would say that I am an intermediate to advanced Spanish speaker. I read Spanish very well. I speak it more and less well, depending on sort of how often I've been doing it and how quickly the person that I'm talking to is speaking back to me. And I can read French fairly well, again, having lived over there. my speaking of French is not great. Sadly, when we lived there, I was traveling around Europe so much that a lot of my stories were in English or through a translator and not in French. But also, I found very quickly that a lot of French people speak Spanish as a second language. And so when I was like in a difficult situation, trying to rent a car in the south of France somewhere, oftentimes I would just speak Spanish and the person that I was dealing with would speak Spanish back.
So that's funny because I learned this after the fact when I was in Barcelona for a conference, and you were one of my Barcelona Sherpas giving me great advice on how to get around that city. And I learned this afterwards that obviously people speak a lot. There's a lot of English spoken or a lot of English language menus and stuff like that in Barcelona, but also native to Barcelona will speak English because they don't like Spanish. Because of the Catalan.
Because of Catalan, yeah, right.
Catalan,
for
so
sure.
it's Catalan or English. Yes. So that's my advantage. But I also got very good at pointing and grunting, and that seemed to work as well.
Yeah.
I'm curious too. So you mentioned you're reporting and you're doing both the writing piece and the video piece for it. And you came up in kind of newspapers, you came up in that traditional round. How much does the reporting differ? Like you mentioned that skill set. What are the skill sets you had to learn, and what was the biggest maybe hurdle you had to overcome or challenge you had to overcome in translating that reporting to kind of like a long form documentary set?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. And there's a lot of differences and also no differences at all. Because, a story is a story, right? And I think that the power of storytelling, the things that make a story powerful are largely the same across, any medium. But that said, there were a lot of new logistics and also just sort of like new problems that come with reporting for video or now with audio, reporting for audio too. I remember one of the very first stories that I did at ESPN. It was a story that I'm incredibly proud of. It's about a team called Chapecoense, a Brazilian soccer team that was in a plane crash on their way to a big championship game in Brazil. And, almost everybody on board died. There were like, a very few survivors. But we went down to Brazil and, did a multi-platform. And I did a, massive written story, but we did I think it was a 60-minute documentary about the team. And there was lots of, controversy and criminal concerns around the circumstances of the plane crash and all of this. But I remember sitting there for the very first interview we did was with a goalkeeper for the team, a backup goalkeeper who had survived the plane crash, but had lost one of his legs. And so I'm sitting there and we're getting ready to do the interview, and I'm dressed for camera because the interview is on camera. And all of a sudden the director of photography comes over and is powdering my face with like makeup. And I'm thinking like, what is going on? He's like, oh, it's hot here. You're sweating. You got to think about like, how you look on camera. And literally during that interview, we would get to like a really emotional moment. Like, he's talking about, like the moment when the lights went out on the plane or whatever. And like, we'd finish and there'd be a break because somebody would need to come over and like wipe his face or wipe my face, And again, like that's not every interview. That's not every circumstance. We were in Brazil outside and it was very, very humid, but like, they're just these things that you think about that I never had to consider when I was just putting my iPhone or my tape recorder down on a table and talking to somebody. And hopefully by the end of it, they didn't even realize there was a tape recorder there. It's like with a camera, however good an interviewer I am, it's impossible not to notice the lights and the people, and so it did make me, and I talk about this in the class that I'm teaching, it did make me consider the way that I ask questions, the way that I approach interviews a little bit differently than when I'm just sitting with a person or, riding in a car with them and we're just talking and the interview is sort of a organic thing as opposed to a television situation where it's almost never organic. There's always an artifice to a television interview, and that presents different challenges. And that's something that I had to get used to, from the storytelling perspective. Like there's a whole other terminology to writing a TV script versus writing a written story. And there was a learning curve, and there still is a learning curve for me doing that now. But like, that's mechanical. Ultimately, act 1, act 2, act 3, you know what I mean? Like the sort of basics of storytelling are the same in whatever medium you're doing it in.
So what were some of those changes that you had to make to interviewing when you're on camera versus when you're doing like the print interview?
I mean, one of them is very basic, and it's just not talking. You know what I mean? I am somebody that I like to think makes people feel comfortable. And I think a lot of that is being an engaged listener and an engaged, participant in a conversation. You know, oftentimes in print interviews or digital interviews, I'll tell a story about my own life, as a way to sort of humanize myself to a person. If I'm talking to somebody about a tragedy, obviously whatever it is that I've gone through in my life isn't apples to apples with whatever they've gone through. But, you want to let somebody know that you can feel the kind of pain that they've felt or the kind of joy that they've felt, and that maybe that will inspire a connection in them. In television, I almost never want to be talking that long. You know what I mean? Like, yes, you want it to feel conversational, but it's not a conversation, like, because they're always the other person is always able to look over my shoulder and seeing a giant camera or a producer, there's a performative element to it. So I found that I had to be a lot more succinct in the way that I asked my questions. I had to be a lot more succinct in the way that I set up my questions. And I had to shut up when the other person was talking. And so, you develop ways to encourage somebody visually, with your hands, with your face, where maybe that wouldn't be as important in a print interview, because I can just be like, yeah, I know what you're saying. Or, oh, that reminds me of, blah, blah, blah. You can interject. You can't do that in television or audio. And so you're doing it right now to me. You're nodding, you're smiling, you're, moving your head around to let me know that you're engaged with the things that I'm saying. And I appreciate that. But you're also not going to be like, a bunch of times, because that will make your podcast sound terrible. And so just that skill set, it sounds simple, but you'd be surprised how much that's a part of most people's everyday conversation technique. And so to break away from that took a little bit of getting used to, for sure.
I am trying so hard. It is so hard to not do that, right? So I did want to ask with interviewing too, and this is one of our fellow student, our mutual students talked about this a lot. And one of the things he took from your class was the idea of the North Star in an interview. And he was very powerful for him. It was Scott Eppelman, for what that's worth. Can you talk about what that is and what that kind of means and how you use it and how you teach it?
Yeah. I mean, the North Star, I think, is an important technique that I think journalists of any experience are wise to keep in mind, because look, there is a fine line between going into an interview with a completely open mind, right? Like I have no preconceived notion about what this person is going to say back to me. I have no particular idea of where it's going to go. I have no, assumption about the thing that this person is trying to say. That is very rare in journalism for that to exist. Generally, we are going to somebody with a desire for their perspective on a particular thing. And so the North Star is just the idea that, like, wherever an interview may go, and for sure, we should allow interviews to develop in the way that the participant or the interviewee wants them to develop. We're there to experience what they have to say. You always want to keep in mind what you are there to get. The concept of the North Star came out of an exercise that we were doing involving podcasts and audio interviewing for narrative podcasting. And I think that medium in particular demands a really tight focus, particularly when you're not able to read words or see images. You have to keep the audience's attention, very tightly and very closely held into sort of whatever the subject of the piece is. And so when you're doing your interview, the North Star is a reminder. Wherever the thing goes, look up in the sky. The North Star is going to tell you, this is what I came for this person. Let me make sure that I'm getting it in every way possible.
So I end every podcast with this question, so I'll give you the chance to. What is the best thing you've read lately?
Oh man, the best thing I've read lately. I've been in a little bit of a memoir phase lately, going back over some older ones and also, published a few years ago, but then also some more recent ones. I read Open, which was Andre Agassi's memoir that was done by J.R. Moehringer. And it was fantastic. And I really appreciated the way that it was both personal, but also like, I liked the way that it was as much about the way Agassi sees other people as the way he sees or saw himself. I appreciated that perspective. And I think JR did a really good job capturing that. I also read Alicia Keys's memoir, which was fantastic. And it was entertaining and it was written tremendously well, but I also just appreciated some of the like storytelling. She tells some incredible stories about, having lunch with like Bono and President Obama at the White House, which is just like, sort of a gold mine for storytelling. So I would say those two leapt to mind immediately, because I've just been sort of in a phase, I guess, of memoir reading. And those two jump out. I think it's a tricky art form, but I think both of those did it really, really, really well. What about you?
So I'm going to really quick just say the Agassi book is one of my favorite sports books I think I've ever read. I come back to it. I was actually just opened it up earlier today just to check out, to read a couple passages. It's brutally honest in a way that I think most sports books aren't, and honest about himself and about other people. So I think it was very good.
Yeah. And I should say too, Moehringer did great with that. And I should equal time. A woman named Michelle Burford wrote Alicia Keys's, and she was terrific too. In the same vein, there was a real rawness to the text, but it never felt like heavy-handed. You know what I mean? It felt very like authentic, but not over the top, which I think is a tough needle to thread. But I think both of those books do it very well.
And the other one I'll say is the Crook Manifesto by Colson Whitehead. It's the second book of his kind of a Harlem trilogy. And Colson Whitehead, he's one of those authors who he puts out a book, I'm rating it sight unseen, doesn't matter what it's about. Nice. He's one of my favorites. And it's a story. It's like 3 individual stories of kind of like a somewhat legit, somewhat not legit furniture dealer in Harlem in the 70s, and very much of the spirit of Harlem and kind of like capturing what was happening in the city back then. And I mean, just beautifully written, beautifully thought out. So I've been on try to read fiction when I'm not working, just because I read so much nonfiction for work. So
it's funny you say that, because when my youngest daughter, she's 9, was at camp, she'd been begging me to read Percy Jackson. I don't know, maybe whether or if you have, listeners that have younger kids. She's read like all 15 of them already, and she's been on me for months to read it. So I read the first, I guess, what is it? The something of Olympus,
the Heroes of Olympus.
I read the first one. Shout out to Rick Riordan. Clearly, he's made a franchise out of this. I found it interesting. I will say I found it better than Harry Potter. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's I didn't read all of the Harry Potters either, but I did find this one to be more entertaining than that.
No, my daughter had her Percy Jackson reading phase a few years ago, and there's a Lightning Thief musical that's one of her favorites, and she actually did at her local theater this past spring. And yeah, I don't know if I haven't read all the books, but they're fantastic.
Yeah, they're entertaining.
They're entertaining, and there's a TV series coming. Disney Plus has a Percy Jackson TV series coming out.
We're well aware of that in my house. Well aware.
Well, the musical is worth it too. The musical is very fun, so if you have a chance to check that out. So, all right, Sam, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Special thanks to Sam Borden for joining us this week. You can get show notes for this episode and all of our episodes wherever you get podcasts or at our home at sportsmediaguy.com. Thanks for listening. Give us a rating, review us, and our theme music, as always, is by Ellie Moritz.